Ever think back to college? Like hanging out with your friends. Just, carefree and having fun.
Yeah, definitely.
And then picture that happiness just ripped away.
Oh, wow.
That's what happened in Moscow, Idaho. Back on November 13th, 2022, four University of Idaho students,
Yeah.
Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mugen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. They were all murdered brutally in their house, off campus.
It's so sad. What strikes me is how normal their lives seemed. And then this horrible, just awful thing happens. It makes you realize how quickly things can change.
It really does. And for 47 days, nobody knew who did it. The whole country was trying to figure it out. Who could do something like this? And then finally, they made an arrest. On December 30th, Brian Koberger. He was actually studying criminology. Can you believe that?
Wow, no kidding.
Yeah, a PhD student at Washington State University. It's right near the University of Idaho.
So close.
Yeah, today we're going to really dig into this whole thing. We'll look at all the evidence, what the prosecution's saying, and what the defense might do.
Sounds good.
But first, we really need to remember the victims. These were real people, with families and friends who missed them terribly.
Absolutely.
Let's start with Kaylee and Maddie. They were best friends since they were kids. And they were found together in the same bed.
Oh, that's just heartbreaking.
Kaylee, she was like really outgoing, adventurous, always up for anything.
Yeah.
And Maddie, everyone said she was so kind and had this amazing smile that would light up a room.
To think they went through that together.
It's awful. And then there's Xana and Ethan. They were dating, just starting their lives together.
It's so young.
Dan was like the life of the party, always bubbly and making everyone laugh.
Yeah.
And Ethan, he was one of triplets, really loved the outdoors, had a gentle soul.
It's just senseless.
Now, the crime scene itself was
Yeah.
really bad, just awful.
I can imagine.
Yeah, one of the first responders even said that blood was oozing from the house. Yeah, that's how much violence there was. They think Maddie was probably the first one attacked, and then Kaylee. They were both on the third floor. The coroner thinks Kaylee might have even woken up while it was happening. Xana and Ethan were on the second floor, in Xana's room or nearby.
So how did he get around, like, through the house? I wonder what that tells us about what happened.
That's what investigators were trying to figure out. They started by going through all this video footage, and they found something. A white Elantra, driving around the victim's house over and over again in the hours before the murders.
Wow, talk about a clue. Surveillance is everywhere these days. You never know what might be caught on camera.
Right. And they were able to trace that car back to Koberger. First, they figured out the make and model. Then they got a list of students from the university who had similar cars, narrowed it down to Koberger.
I see.
They got his driver's license photo, and get this, one of the roommates who survived said she saw the killer, and she described him as having bushy eyebrows, just like Koberger.
It's amazing how little details like that can crack a case wide open. Makes you realize how important it is to pay attention to everything.
Absolutely. But it wasn't just the car. They also used his cell phone data. And it showed that he was near that house 12 times before the murders. So it looks like he might have been stalking them.
12 times? That's not just a coincidence. You have to wonder what his motive was.
Yeah, and on the night of the murders, his phone went off the network at 2:47 a.m., around the same time that White Elantra was seen leaving his apartment complex. And then 2 hours later, he was back on, south of Moscow. Like he was driving back home.
Turning off your phone during a crime, pretty suspicious, right? Like he was trying to hide what he was doing.
Exactly. But the most important evidence came from his family's house, all the way in Pennsylvania. The investigators went through their trash. They found DNA.
Oh, wow. That's incredible.
Yeah, and it matched the DNA on a knife sheath they found at the crime scene, a military-style knife sheath.
It's amazing what they can do with DNA these days. To think they could link him to the crime scene from his family's garbage.
It was the big break they needed. That DNA evidence connected him directly to the murders, and they were able to arrest him.
What do you think is the strongest evidence so far?
Well, for me, it's the DNA, for sure.
Yeah.
And the cell phone records putting him right there at the house, plus the roommate's description. It all adds up.
Yeah, it's pretty damning. But we also need to consider the defense's side.
Right, and that's where things can get really interesting. They're going to try and poke holes in everything the prosecution has and come up with other explanations. We'll talk about that in the next part of our deep dive.
So the defense, it's like, what are they going to do?
Right. It's like a chess game, trying to figure out their strategy. They don't have to prove he's innocent. They just have to make the jury doubt he's guilty. And one thing they might try to do is question the whole motive thing. Like, why would this guy, this criminology student, target these specific people? There's no connection.
It's a good point. If you're the prosecution, you have to show not only that he could have done it, but that he actually wanted to. And if there's no clear reason, well, that makes it harder.
Definitely. And they're also going to go after the cell phone data,
Ooh.
saying it just shows he was in the area, not inside the house. Maybe he was just driving around, not stalking anyone.
The old wrong place, wrong time defense. They could say he was out for a drive, maybe even collecting data for his studies. It's a bit of a stretch, but I've seen it before.
Yeah, but 12 times, come on. And then there's that DNA they found
Hmm.
at the crime scene. Doesn't match Koberger, it's from some other guy. The defense might try to use that to say that someone else was involved.
Oh, yeah. Bringing in other potential suspects always throws things off, creates doubt. The prosecution's going to have to show that that DNA either doesn't matter or that it belongs to someone who wasn't involved.
There's been a lot of talk online about drugs being a motive. Maybe something went wrong, some kind of retaliation. But the families are adamant. They say their kids were not into drugs, period.
You know, drugs are always a popular theory in these cases, especially when it's not clear why someone would do something like this. But if the families are so sure, that definitely casts doubt on that idea.
Yeah. And speaking of the families, you got to give them credit. They've been through hell, but they haven't given up. They're doing everything they can to get justice, even doing their own investigating and sharing what they find.
It's really inspiring to see. They're not letting the speculation and all the media frenzy drown out the truth. They're focused on honoring their loved ones.
Kaylee's sister, Olivia, even named her new baby after Kaylee and Maddie, Theodore and Maddie Kay, keeping their memory alive.
Wow, that's beautiful. And Ethan's parents started a foundation, Ethan's Smile. It gives out
Mm.
scholarships, taking all that pain and turning it into something positive, a way to honor Ethan's legacy.
It's amazing how resilient they are, finding hope in the midst of so much loss. So the trial is set for June 2025, a long way off. It's hard to say what will happen.
Yeah, trials are always unpredictable, especially a case like this. It's going to be intense, with the defense trying to tear down the prosecution's case and the prosecution fighting back. We'll just have to wait and see.
While we wait, though, it's worth thinking about the bigger picture. What does this case tell us about how we use forensic science? How has technology changed investigations? And how do we as a society deal with something this awful? How do we even begin to heal?
Those are all really important questions. Even if we don't have all the answers right now, thinking about them, really digging into the complexities of this case, it's important. It makes us think critically, question what we assume, and consider different points of view.
It reminds us that finding the truth takes time. Even in this world where everything moves so fast, it's a slow and careful process. And sometimes the answers we're looking for, they take a while to come out.
Now let's talk about what the trial might actually look like. The prosecution, they're going to have to be really thorough, laying out all their evidence, showing how it all fits together.
Yeah, they'll probably focus on that DNA from the knife sheath. That's a direct link to Koberger. And then there's the cell phone data. They'll try to paint it as him stalking the victims.
Right, and don't forget the roommate who saw the killer. They'll have to convince the jury that her description matches Koberger, that it wasn't someone else.
And what about the defense? What's their game plan?
Well, they'll try to find weaknesses in the prosecution's case, any little inconsistencies, any gaps in the evidence. Maybe they'll say the DNA isn't reliable, that it got contaminated or something.
Or they could try to downplay the cell phone records, saying that just being near the house doesn't mean he did anything. Maybe he had other reasons to be in that area.
Exactly. And they'll definitely bring up that unidentified DNA. They'll use that to suggest that maybe there was another person involved, to make the jury wonder if maybe they got the wrong guy.
It all comes down to circumstantial evidence.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be a big part of this trial. It basically means using evidence to make an inference. Like if there's a fingerprint at a crime scene, you can infer the person was there. It's not like someone actually saw them do it.
Right. And in this case, a lot of the evidence against Koberger is like that. The DNA on the sheath, the cell phone data, it's up to the prosecution to weave it all together into a story that makes sense.
And the defense will try to unravel that story. They'll say that DNA is no good, that the cell phone data doesn't prove anything, and that without someone actually seeing Koberger in the house with the victims, the jury shouldn't convict.
It's a battle of the lawyers, really. The prosecution has to be convincing, and the defense has to create enough doubt. It's high stakes, and it could go either way.
And in the end, it's up to the jury. They have to look at all the evidence, listen to the witnesses, and decide if the prosecution has proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt.
It's a huge responsibility. It shows how important it is to have a jury that's fair and impartial. Their decision will change Koberger's life forever, and it will have a big impact on the victims' families and the whole community.
This reminds us that justice isn't just about punishing someone. It's about holding people accountable, finding closure, and trying to heal.
Well said. The trial's not till June 2025, but the whole country will be watching, waiting to see what happens, hoping for answers and for some sense of justice for these victims.
And while the trial might give us some answers, the pain of this tragedy, it's going to last a long time. Kaylee, Maddie, Xana, and Ethan, they won't be forgotten. Not by their loved ones, not by the community, and not by anyone who's been following this case.
This is such a stark reminder of the darkness that exists in the world, even in places that seem safe and peaceful. It forces us to confront these tough questions about crime, justice, and how fragile life really is.
And in the last part of our deep dive, we're going to explore those questions even more. Think about what this case can teach us about ourselves and the world around us. So, we've talked about the evidence, the defense, the victims, everything. But there's one thing that just keeps nagging at me.
What's up?
Motive. Like, why? Why would Koberger do this? If there's really no connection between him and the victims, like the defense says, what was his reason? How's the prosecution going to explain that?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The missing piece. They might try to say that it was like a fantasy for him, like he had this dark side, this fascination with violence, and it just like took over. They could use his criminology studies to back that up. Like he was obsessed with crime, and then it went too far.
Ugh, it's creepy. But it would kind of fit. I mean, the attack seems so random, and there's no obvious link to the victims.
Right, exactly. Or they could go the personality disorder route, try to show that he wasn't mentally stable, and that's why he did it. But that's a tough one to prove in court, especially without like a full psychological evaluation.
Yeah, and then you get into the whole mental health issue. How much does that play into criminal behavior? It's a tricky subject, but you can't ignore it in cases like this.
Absolutely. Not everyone with a mental illness is going to commit a crime, obviously, but understanding someone's mental state, like why they do what they do, how they think, it's important when you're trying to figure out if they're actually responsible for their actions.
In the end, it comes down to the jury. They're going to have to consider everything, all the evidence, the witnesses, and decide if Koberger is guilty, beyond a reasonable doubt.
And that's a huge responsibility. It shows how important it is to have people on that jury who can be fair and objective, because their decision is going to affect a lot of lives. Koberger's, for sure, but also the victims' families and the whole community.
It makes you realize that justice is about more than just punishment. It's about accountability and closure and hopefully some kind of healing.
You got it. The trial's still a few years away, June 2025. But you can bet everyone will be watching, waiting to see what happens, hoping for answers, and justice for those poor kids.
And while the trial might bring some answers, I think the effects of this whole thing are going to be felt for a long time. Those 4 students, Kaylee, Maddie, Xana, and Ethan, their families will never forget them, and neither will the community. And I think anyone who's followed this case will remember it too.
This case, it really shows us just how dark things can get, Even in places that seem totally normal, safe, it makes us think about the bad things people are capable of, and about crime, justice, how fragile life is.
If you want to learn more about this case, there's a really good episode of 48 Hours that goes into a lot of detail. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts.
It's been heavy, this deep dive, and it leaves you with a lot to think about. Like, how do we understand something so awful? How do we find meaning in all the chaos?
Yeah, we might get a verdict from the trial, but the real impact of this crime, all the pain and loss, that's going to stay with people for years. Kaylee, Maddie, Xana, and Ethan, their memory will live on, not just in the courtroom, but in the hearts of everyone who loved them. And that's what's really important.